Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I am here with my reading wrap up and my dog lady. She wanted to come join us today. But today we're here for November reading. So let's start with the first book I finished in November, which was The Stonewetta by Octavia Cade. This is a really fascinating book. I was looking for a buddy read with my friend who lives in South Korea, and we're trying to read books from all over the world, and this one came up, and I saw that several of the people that I follow, especially Shannon over at That So Po, had read and really enjoyed this book. So I said, all right, let's start reading it. It's really fascinating, futuristic, environmental, like speculative fiction. It's definitely speculative fiction, but every chapter starts with a description of an animal, and then it transitions from that animal into the human whose perspective we're in. So every chapter is a different perspective, and there's a bit of a mystery going on in that somebody is stealing data, climate change data, and these scientists all over the world are trying to preserve climate change data. That's all I will say. You have to be into like odd storytelling, and into really wanting to take a chance with some of this. But for me, it was really, really worth it. My friend who buddy read it with me also enjoyed it. The next book that I finished in November is a book that my class was reading. I did not assign the whole book, but I assigned large chunks of it, and that is Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. I taught a class on race and ethnicity in U.S. history, and I really wanted to do a lot of like medical history. This book is by Harriet Wahington, a fabulous historian. This is an amazing book. A lot of chapters in here are very readable, and I recommend for a wider audience if you're interested in this history. There are a few chapters that I think are a little bit heavier, more like if you don't know the history, it'll be harder to understand, because she uses a lot of medical terms, and like some chapters just require that because of the topics. But there's so much in this book to dissect. For example, it talks about the Tuskegee experimentation. So that is where African American men were tested for syphilis. If they tested positive, they would be admitted into the study, and then they were denied treatment because they wanted to see like the full cycle of what syphilis looked like on Black men. Well, initially, the ethics were great from the very beginning, but then over the course of the study, there was a treatment, effective treatment became available for people with syphilis, and so it's extremely unethical and really illegal for them to deny treatment that was available for these men. A lot of them end up actually transmitting syphilis to their wives, to their children, and so, a lot of these men died over the course of the study, and it was just extreme because the scientists that were doing the study would go out of their way to go to clinics and doctors and ask that treatment be denied of these men. And you might think, oh, okay, so that we know about this is well known. Okay, yeah. But the book goes into the present day and shows how even into the 1980s and 90s, the American government was still illegally, unethically experimenting in Black communities. There is discussions of the forced sterilizations of the doctors that developed the field of gynecology and how they experimented on Black enslaved women. It is horrific history. This one, I do kind of recommend reading it the way I assign it to my students in like small chunks, because it's really heavy and it's really infuriating, really extremely infuriating what our government did, what medical practitioners, doctors, nurses, like what people were willing to do it's horrific. And to me, the application of this to today and the relevance to today is that, one, some of these things are still in danger of happening, but it also explains why in certain communities, in certain Black communities especially, there's a lot of hesitancy towards the COVID vaccine, towards trusting government officials and trusting medical experts. As a lot of times in the scientific and the medical community, you just expect people to like get it. Hey, we're giving you something that's good for you. But there's a very real history of Black communities being told that and then being experimented on in very dangerous ways. And so I'm like, I know that with COVID, things are complex and the reason people don't get the vaccine so this is not talking about everyone who is not getting the COVID vaccine, but there are pockets of Black communities that have a very real fear of any kind of government intervention in the community. And it's justified. The next book that I finished, you're going to see a pattern in my November reading. Some really heavy reading along with some romance, because that is my genre that I like to pair with heavy reading because it's comforting and it will cleanse my palate from a lot of the heavier stuff. So the next book I finished was The Duke Heist. This is book number 1 in the Wild Winchester series by Erica Ridley. So Kazen over at Always Doing, she really loves the series and loves this author, and so I wanted to give it a try, and my library happened to have this. So in this story, you have a bunch of siblings, adopted siblings that were adopted by this British nobleman, and they really created a family together. The nobleman passed away, and now each sibling is figuring out their place in the world and, romantic relationships. So this is one of the daughters who believes that she is very forgettable. She's been using that skill to her advantage. But here comes this Duke who is going to pay attention to her. Her and her siblings are trying to get a painting back from the Duke, and they are planning on stealing it back. And so initially it's like a heist story, and then of course romance ensues. This is a really sweet book. Initially, I wasn't sure if the humor and the writing was going to mesh really well with me, but I got really into it and ended up liking it. So I'm going to continue reading the series. The next book I finished was Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That the Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. This is a book that got really popular last year for a while, and it's merited. This is a really good book, especially I think white feminists need to really read this book to understand why there is so much skepticism within communities of color towards white feminists. And it is because there's a history of racism within the feminist movement, and there's also a way in which white feminists approach feminism that tends to exclude women of color in very real ways. And oftentimes, patriarchy and racial injustice are meshed, they're intertwined, but white feminists a lot of times demand that women of color set aside racial issues in order to fight patriarchy, but that tends to benefit only white women because there's other layers of oppression for women of color, including racism and classism. And what Kendall does really well in this book is lay it all out clearly in terms that everybody can understand. And so for women of color that have been studying feminism, that pay a lot of attention to these issues, most of what Kendall talks about in here will not be new. It's still a really good recap of a really good compilation of all these issues. But I think it is especially for white feminists that should be reading this book and learning some of this history that, paints feminism through a more critical lens. The next book I finished in November was One Week to Claim It All by Adriana Herrera. This is book number 1 in the Zambrano Studios series. I flew through this book. I really liked it, but I have to admit, Adriana Herrera is one of my favorite romance writers, and in this book we are following Esmeralda Zambrano, whose father was the founder of Zambrano Studios, but she was the bastard daughter. She had her father and mother had her out of wedlock, and her father ends up marrying somebody else. He kind of continues helping the mom for some period of time afterwards, but then Esmeralda just loses connection with her father. But she ends up studying media and wants to develop television and films for a diverse Latinx community. And she gets the chance to basically become the head of Zambrano Studios, except she needs to fight for that position with one of her exes, who she had a very brief but very intense relationship with, Rodrigo. But it turns out Rodrigo had basically chosen her father over her. At least that's what Esmeralda thinks. And so the whole story takes place over the course of 1 week. So it's very intense. It works though because Esmeralda and Rodrigo have a previous relationship, right? So it's a second chance romance, and these are not my favorite romances, second chance romances. But in this particular story, it helps because we can understand why the relationship is so intense right from the get-go. These two people have history, and we get to learn their history along the way. So I really liked this story. The next book I finished was Roberto Bolaño's Amuleto. So this is a story set in 1968 in Mexico during the student massacre at Tlatelolco, but it follows Auxilio Lacouture, who comes to Mexico somewhere around 1968 and sees herself as the muse of writers and poets, and she is kind of like a social butterfly within the artistic community and the college community in Mexico. It's a fictional story, but through her eyes we get to see these groups, kind of what the atmosphere was like, of rebellion, of poetry, of inspiration, of rebellion amongst the people that made up the social movements of 1968 in Mexico. And it's told quite beautifully. I really liked it. I'll say more. I have a few more books to read about 1968 in Mexico, and then I'll come back and chat more about it. But I found this one to be quite compelling and to have a very interesting point of view because, one, you're seeing things through this female main character, but she's also a bit of an outsider because she's not Mexican, she's not a poet, she's not a writer, but she feels deeply for all of these people. Really enjoyed it. The next book I finished in November was Whiteout. This is book number 1 in the Survival Instinct series by Adriana Anders, set in Antarctica, in a research facility in Antarctica where, the weather's about to change here, and so scientists have done the core of the research they need to do, and so every year researchers come to this facility along with support staff, and most of them are about to take off. Only a few researchers stay to kind of complete their studies, and they're there kind of year round. So one of our main characters is the chef for this facility. This is her first year at the facility, and she's been really intrigued by one of the scientists, but he's very aloof and kind of grumpy, rough, always giving her dirty looks. But she's very intrigued by him. There's a connection there. There's chemistry. And all of a sudden, everybody's about to leave, and then all these bad guys put their plan into action to steal some research. So the rest of the story, you're figuring out why these guys want this research, and then these two people are brought together and they must figure out what this chemistry, what this relationship could be. All the while, you're in Antarctica. So it's actually it's a fun romantic thriller. It's really fun. It's intense. It like captured my attention and held it for the entire time. So I really enjoyed this. And I'm not a huge like romantic thriller reader. At least I haven't been lately. But this was definitely a winner for me. Next, I finished Crying in H Mart by Michelle Saunders. I really liked this book. I ended up buddy reading it with Shannon over at that Sopo, kind of by accident. We hadn't planned it, but we ended up picking it up at the same time. And I always update my Goodreads of like when I start reading a book, I'll update Goodreads, and when I finish a book, I'll update Goodreads. And so it turns out she was reading at the same time, or she had the book at the same time. And it's a really fast read. It's a memoir about grief. And so the way she tells it, it's very intense, very personal. It's very raw. Like she really like lays out some ugly feelings out there about her relationship with her mother. And I felt like that was really honest and intense. Shannon made a really good point though about how unlike other memoirs, there wasn't a lot of reflection here. A lot of it is very like self-centered and doesn't have the same kind of reflection that other memoirs might have. I definitely got that. There were times in which I was kind of mad at Michelle because I was like, what are you doing? Don't do that. Don't do that. You're seeing her make these decisions in a very extreme circumstance, and just they can appear reactionary at times, and so that made me very anxious as I was reading it, and I know that the same is true for Shannon. In the end though, I really enjoyed it. I like really these kind of really emotional memoirs and stories, and so yeah, I was really fascinated. That first story that the book is named after, about her crying in H Mart, about how her mom is Korean, and her dad is white American, and her mom was her connection to her Korean roots. And so losing her mom has a ton of meaning for her. It's not just losing her mom, although that itself is really intense, but it's also like this feeling of also losing your connection to your roots, and kind of having to figure out who you are without that person that gives you this connection. And that was really beautifully written, and yeah, that was really good. So I really enjoyed this one as well. The next book I finished was Just for the Holidays. This is Zambrano Studios novella, book number 2. And this is the younger sister Perla, and Perla is in love with her first love, this man she met in college who was an actor and who she thought they had a really great relationship, and then all of a sudden he just breaks it off with her. He has gone on to have a very successful career, and now Perla is back to working for her family studios and is in charge of casting for a new series they're developing. And he would be the perfect lead character. The creators of the show want him, and she's like, okay, well, I have to put my feelings aside and I need to go convince him to be in this this TV show. And then they kind of get stuck together in his house with his family, and it is just really great. You see a lot of elements of Caribbean culture. Adriana Herrera, the author, is Dominican, and so it's always clear how much love she puts into the depictions of Caribbean cultures, and especially of like the Latinx community in the U.S. with those Caribbean roots. And her ex's family for Perla is kind of that connection to the Caribbean roots, because her mom was a snob and never really into providing that connection to her children. And Perla is just, she's like a self-possessed woman who has figured out who she is and is now just trying to figure out what this reconnecting with her ex means. It is so lovely. The main male character's name is Gael, and if you follow Latinx actors, Gael's story in this book is a lot like the Oluna story. At least his career a little bit. Like, I know Adriana was inspired by that. It's just very clear if you know who these people are, and that was like a nice little context clue there for people that know. The next book I finished was Ravished by Amanda Quick. I used to read all of Amanda Quick's books. This is Amanda Quick is the pseudonym for Jane Ann Kranz's historical romances. So it's in Regency era romance. We are following Harriet and Gideon, and Harriet is kind of a wallflower and really interested in bones. She's not interested in London society. She's not interested in coming out or marriage. She feels that at like 20 something she's old. She's a wallflower, weird intellectual, and she's embraced that because all she wants to do is go hunting for bones. And as she's hunting for bones in the local village caves, she finds a bunch of thieves are using her bone caves to like hide the stolen goods. So she writes a letter to the local nobleman saying, hey, your caves are getting used by a bunch of robbers to hide their loot. Come fix this. And the nobleman's like, Gideon's like, who's ordering me around? I'm a nobleman. Nobody orders a nobleman around, but this woman's ordering me around. So he's intrigued enough that he goes to see her, and she sees him, and he's like, yeah, clear out my case, please. If you don't do something about it, I'll do it. In fact, I'll help you. Tell me what your plan is, and let me tell you all about these cases. And he becomes so intrigued by this woman. But Gideon has some dark history that he needs to work through because he is seen as somebody who caused the suicide of his fiance, who was the vicar's daughter. And so he has to kind of deal with that past before, he can really engage in a relationship with her and with Harriet. And it's so lovely. It's so action-packed too. Typically that storyline, would take the whole book, but the whole cave thing is resolved in the first third of the book. And so there's other drama, other action happening, but it's all brought together, and it's wonderfully written. But it is one of these books that like breaks a lot of conventions of the romance genre in terms of like narrative, but does it really extremely well, and it is fantastic. This book, I believe I found through the podcast Fated Mates. They were recommending it. My library had it, and I was like, give it to me. Historical romances are what got me into romance, so I loved being back in that mode. The next book that I finished, I read for my book club, for my local book club. It is The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. I've been wanting to read St. James for a while, and finally got to The Sundown Motel. So this is a story that's set over the course of 1982 and then in 2017. You have this young adult, this college student whose mother dies of cancer, and so that kind of prompts her to go back into her family history because her aunt disappeared when her aunt was around her age. She had gone to this town in upstate New York, and then nobody heard from her again. She just disappeared. And it turns out that in this town, several young women have disappeared or died, and just like, it's really odd. And so she goes back there to investigate, and in the story you go back and forth between her aunt in 1982 kind of learning things about this town, and then our main character in today kind of figuring out the same things that her aunt was figuring out back in the day. And a lot of the drama happens around this motel because this is where her aunt worked when she was in town, and then our main character ends up getting a job there as well. and like it's really creepy. I read this book while my significant other was away for the day at night alone with all kinds of creepy sounds. I got really, like, I scared myself by reading it alone at night. And when my significant other called me that night, I told him I was reading this book. He was like, stop. And I was like, but I can't. And I couldn't. I like breezed through this book because I was just like, what's happening? I really enjoyed it. Not everybody will. I think part of it, sometimes the characters are making choices that you're like, why are you doing that? Don't do that. That is the dumbest thing you can do in this situation. But I suspended belief with a lot of thrillers and books that involve kind of ghosts and things like that, and supernatural. I have to suspend belief and allow myself to just be immersed in the story, and I was able to do that with this book. So there you go. The next book I finished was Donut Fall in Love by Jackie Lau. Jackie Lau writes wonderful romances with a lot of food. It's dangerous to read her romances because they're gonna make you hungry. But in this one, you follow an actor, Ryan. That seems to have been a theme in some of my romances this month. And Lindsay owns a donut shop, and Ryan is like walking in downtown Toronto, and he's like, donut shop. All right, my camera shut off at some point, so I don't know exactly where it left off, but I think it probably shut off while I was talking about Pretty Little Lion. This was a book that is a thriller. It has a lot of action. It's kind of speculative, futuristic, and it just worked. The first book did not really work for me, but the second one really worked. I think I just liked the characters a little bit better. I didn't have as many problems with some of the other elements, like the sex scenes and how fast some of the action had moved in the first one. But in this one, I thought the pacing was really well done. I liked the main storyline, and I liked the secondary storyline. So I was just fully immersed and so in for this book. If the author ever writes more books in this series, I will pick them up. I will read them. But I also completely understand why she would not want to be in this particular situation or writing these books again. And then the last book that I read for December was The Moskovat by Yuri Andrukovich. So this is a Ukrainian writer writing about a Ukrainian main character in Moscow in the 1990s. And this was so interesting to me because I have not read other books with this premise. And part of this story was really uncomfortable because you're in the head of this male character. He's in his 20s. He's in this like dorm room with a bunch of other men from different parts of like the former Soviet Empire. And they're very sexual. They're drinking, smoking. They're like, it's a very extreme masculine environment, and that made me uncomfortable. However, the narrative style was interesting. There are times in the story in which you're not sure if what the character is experiencing is real or if it's a fantasy of his, whether he is making it up, whether he's high or drunk experiencing this. And that brought a level of interesting element there that I could hold on to. In addition, I felt like there are things that are handled on here that at first gave me pause, like sexual assault. There's a clear sexual assault scene at the start of the book, and it's not clear if it's real or not. But later in the story, it is acknowledged as sexual assault. Like in the moment, it's not. Like the main character sees it as sex. But later on in the story, there's an acknowledgement of that having been sexual assault. Even though we're still not told that whether it's real or not, whether it actually happened or whether it was just in the character's head. And for that really redeemed that element of the book for me, because otherwise I was just gonna hate it. I like, once that happens, there's no acknowledgement that it's sexual assault and not just like sex. Because originally I was not okay with that story. It was reminding me a lot of my experience reading On the Road, where you're in the head of a male character who I just was not connecting with. night. And actually, as I was reading it, I was really comparing these two books a lot, On the Road with the Mosquivat, because they share a lot of themes of this like male experience. But I think the Mosquivat handles those themes better than On the Road. So I did not enjoy reading the Mosquivat. I would not read it again. I would not recommend anyone pick it up, except for if you liked the themes of On the Road. I think the Mosquivat handles those themes in a more interesting setting and with a better narrative. And so I think there is a readership for this book. In addition, if you're interested in what the feeling of being in Moscow in the 90s, post-Cold War, with the Soviet Empire crumbling, but also like still trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together, that was really interesting. There were sections in this book in the middle that were really, really kind of cool and interesting to see. But overall, the book just didn't work for me. So there you go. I'm so glad I read it. I'm so glad I buddy read this book with my friend Korea, because if I were not buddy reading this book, I would have probably DNF'd it. And at the end, I am glad that we stuck through it. We finished this book. And now we have moved on to a different one. So that is it. Those are all the books that I read in December. If you have read any of these, if you are interested in any of them, or if you want to share any thoughts with me down in the comments section, please do so. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.